Welcome to Interview with a Vampire Part 4. We're here, guys. We made it. First and foremost, if you're just joining us now at Part 4, please go back to Interview with a Vampire Part 1 and start your journey there because this series goes over each and every part of Interview with a Vampire. But second of all, if you are here and have been here the whole time, huge thank you to you guys. I know that watching 1 to 4 is a long commitment, and I really appreciate you being here and joining me for this ride. A quick synopsis of where we left off in Part 3. Claudia and Louis have traveled to Paris. They finally met real vampires. They got caught for killing Lestat, and Claudia ended up being killed. Louis went psycho mode on everyone and ended up killing all the vampires involved in Claudia's death. And then he and Armand had a little bit of a meeting and they decided to go travel the world together as vampire partners. Which, of course, brings us right into Part 4. If any of you guys are like me, you might be wondering, this is still going on. I thought we hit an obvious and natural conclusion back in Part 3, and you'd be 100% correct. This Part 4 seems really tacked on to the end. It feels unlike anything we've read so far, and ultimately, I think for the most part, it's the most forgettable part of Interview with a Vampire. However, thematically, I do appreciate its existence because like a vampire keeps going and going and going way past natural expiration date, so does this story. We had a natural, perfect human conclusion. Louis losing Claudia, Louis getting revenge for Claudia, and riding off into the moonrise with Armand. But of course, we can't leave it there on an upper note. We've got to see what Louis has been doing since then and why he's here by himself in this interview room with David. From a storytelling point, Interview has an interesting problem to tackle because, like with the more modern John Wick stories, where John Wick's dog gets killed and he goes on a revenge killing spree to get back at everyone who harmed his animal, Louis is in a tough spot. Just like we're 4 movies deep now into this John Wick saga and he has never gone back to that normal life he treated everything to have, Louis is also in this situation where, like, how does he go back to a normal vampire existence? How does he find equilibrium after this end to Claudia? And the easiest answer is that Louis really doesn't go back to a normal life. He and Armand do travel the world. They experience fine art, beautiful natural wonder, the whole 9 yards. But Louis, even though he enjoys experiencing it, he never really seeks anything anymore. He's not looking for new knowledge or enlightenment. He's not looking for justification to exist. Done with humanity. He's done with change and goodness, and he wants nothing but to kill and to look at beautiful things in between those kills. And this sort of suggests that in the end, the vampires in the Theatre des Vampires really did win. They were right. Vampires don't change, they don't create, and they don't grow. Only humans have the skill for poetry, art, finer things, and change and development. Louis is incapable of being anything than what he always thought he was, which is an evil, cold, emotionless killer. He is literally embodying everything that both he and Claudia detested so much from those vampires. Louis might still love the world. He might still observe art and nature and the world and acknowledge its glory and inherent goodness. But there's a big difference between observing and seeking. Observing versus learning, and observing versus giving back. And Louis takes nothing and wants nothing anymore. Louis is significantly changed after Claudia's death, and we can see some influences from both of his previous vampire mentors. From Armand, he seems to take that stillness, that determination to exist and continue observing and noticing the beauty and wonder in the world. He also takes that frugal lifestyle and overall stillness and long pause of contemplation before doing anything. And from Lestat, he ends up taking that fierceness, that sharp tongue he sometimes had, the satisfaction with the kill, the idea that he can drink until he is full and be sated and happy. And he also takes that intense devotion that Lestat seemed to have to him. We don't see this necessarily between Louis and Armand, but Louis continues to be devoted to Claudia and his mourning of her and the idea of her long after she's left this world. Louis spends many years wondering if it would have been different, if he could have just seen Claudia and Madeline leave and be free and existing in the world on their own. But in the end, he decides that everything is inevitable and futile. Even if Claudia Claudia was alive, Louis would eventually have become cold, lifeless, disinterested, and detached. It just all happened faster. And as always, we have to ask, do you agree with Louis? Would everything have ended the same no matter Claudia's survival? When you have eternity, must you eventually become detached from the world? And are you incapable of loving in the long term, or is love a feeling that you can continue to embody forever in an immortal existence? So about 100 years or so pass of Louis and Armand palling around the world. Louis kind of discounts Armand's presence. He's there, but they rarely talk or interact. And Armand continues like poking and prodding Louis and suggesting that they should go visit New Orleans, go back to his roots. And Louis keeps like sort of agreeing out of some kind of gentlemanly guilt, but never actually going because he realizes that he's not really providing for Armand or doing for Armand what he said he would. And then finally, one evening, Armand pushes the point a little bit by revealing to Louis that Lestat survived the attack at the Théâtre des Vampires and went back to New Orleans to like live out his undead life. And we have to hold everything here because this is the third time that Armand has deceived Louis in this kind of way. And we don't get anything from the narrative describing like annoyance or wrongdoing or anything like that. So I just feel obligated to step in for a minute and ask why this is not a bigger deal. I mean, seriously, Louis goes on for pages and pages about how awful Lestat is, how he's a tyrant, how he's manipulative, how he won't ever let him leave. And Armand has been manipulating Louis from the beginning. First, like, forcing him to turn Madeline so that he can leave Claudia to be with Armand. Then, like, not really being there when Claudia and Madeline get burned, I guess because Louis wasn't deciding to leave them fast enough for Armand's liking, even though he's a 400-year-old vampire and could have waited forever. Or he could have just, like, joined the group and it could have been Claudia and Madeline and Louis. Like, it was never adequately explained to me why they had to go separate ways. And now, here Armand is saying that he also knows that Lestat successfully escaped the Théâtre des Vampires and never mentioned it in over 100 years of them traveling the globe because he was afraid it would like upset Louis when he was going through a difficult time. 100 years, my guy? Seriously. No, Armand is like manipulative and secretive and withholds information to try and get desired reactions and responses from Louis to get what he wants. And this is something that like adult Jess finds fascinating because when I first read Interview with a Vampire as a teen, I was significantly more anti-Lestat and pro-Armand. I wanted that Louis-Armand relationship to work out so badly as a teenager and never understood why it didn't. And I think part of it is because I was influenced by how Louis describes things. I wasn't like objectively looking at the interactions and how they were treating each other and who was doing more damage. I was more taking like Louis's word for it that Lestat was like an abusive beast and Armand was like the most gentle and patient of lovers. But it really seems like here, perhaps Lestat was the more authentic of the two of them and Armand is the more dangerous vampire to be around. To no one's surprise, mentioning Lestat is really all Armand ever needed to do to get Louis to go back to New Orleans. Louis is pleased with how much it hasn't changed as much as pleased that so many things have changed in that city he once walked with Claudia and Lestat. He goes on a homecoming tour, viewing Point de Lac, the old townhouse the three of them used to live at. He's reliving those nostalgic memories and feeling something that, while not like Paris, seems very close to happiness, at least in his descriptions. And Louis is so confident that if Lestat survived, he'll be here in New Orleans and all he has to do is look. He eventually stumbles across a younger vampire and ends up following him around for a while because he figures if Lestat's here, he's connected to all the vampires in the area. And this eventually pays off because that younger vampire one night has a rushed kill in a house where he drinks from a woman and brings out a young infant child that he carries back to this decrepit old mansion where in the middle of this blazing summer heat there's a huge fire and there's a cranky vampire in a robe and slippers like shuffling around complaining that they're too cold. And even in an old bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, Louis recognizes the hair, that voice. This huddled creature is the Lestat As Lewis observes the interactions between the younger vampire and this older vampire, he learns that Lestat no longer leaves the house. He's killing mostly animals, and he's like leaving the animal carcasses piled up in a corner over here, which is highly unusual for vampires. They usually can't stand to be anywhere near the dead bodies of their kills. And killing animals in general is incredibly unusual for Lestat. He used to mock Lewis mercilessly for it. Before Lewis even knows what he's doing, though, he just has to know more. He like taps up against the window. The two vampires turn and see him, and Lestat is like ecstatic and like begging him to come in and join them, and Lewis is like heading in before he can think better of it. And as Lewis and Lestat reunite, Lestat is so moved and overwhelmed, he's having trouble speaking, and Lewis goes to him and sort of like help guides him to a chair, tells him it's okay, he doesn't have to speak, to take his time, and he's also like insisting that he won't hurt Lestat the same way he's sort of been insisting to David this whole time he's not going to hurt him. He's got like a very protective, gentlemanly air going on. The infant baby that's in the room has been crying. Lewis is like picks that kid up and starts trying to comfort it and getting it to simmer down. He just wants everything to be like calm and have like this nice visit with Lestat. And briefly, Lewis also has this aside where he's never killed something as young as this child, and he seems to be more interested and invested in describing the infant and its reactions and emotions than he is actually interacting with Lestat, which is a sort of strange thing for him to do after so long a reunion. Lestat apologizes for Claudia's death. He said he never wanted Santiago to kill her, never intended for that outcome. He says he never wanted Claudia to die. He just wanted her to learn a lesson, and he wanted Lewis with him just so badly. But in the same breath, claiming that he wanted Claudia to continue to exist, he also claims he never should have made Claudia to begin with. She was too young, and she was not right as a vampire. And Lewis doesn't react in anger or upset or any other emotion we've learned to expect from him. Instead, Lewis goes still, and he seems to be thinking about how it seems Claudia never even existed at all. The secret and secluded nature of vampire life allows the loss of one of their own to feel very similar to a family's loss of a child or a miscarriage. How does one appropriately mourn such a young life? How does one reconcile with a loss that's such great personal import and impacts the world so little? Lestat inevitably asks Lewis to come home and stay with him forever, and Lewis refuses. And Lewis observes that Lestat is at the end of his Eras tour. A siren goes by while the two of them are talking, and Lestat jumps and like buries himself in Lewis's chest in sheer abject terror of the sound and the red flashing light. And Lestat asks Lewis how he can stand it, and Lewis is beginning to understand that this is that slow, vampiric death that Armand was speaking about back at Paris, where vampires can't survive past their era. He thinks about how Lestat was and their time in New Orleans together. He was lively and singing. He loved theater and the arts and killing and interacting with people on the streets and singing and repeating lines from all kinds of plays. And all of that engagement and interest and pride in his looks doesn't at all resemble the cuddling creature that Lestat has become now. And he wonders if that investment in humanity is all paid back on inability to understand or adjust as time moves on without you. Lewis implies that that detachment that he's gained and that Armand has always had is a necessary survival and coping mechanism for vampires as they continue to age and progress through humanity. If they're too involved in mortal life, if they care too deeply or become too invested in any one era, they're not able to deal with it when times change and things move on. And it leaves them in this state that Lestat is in now, where they're wasting away as the world keeps going. Lewis ponders all the things he might say to Lestat, all the warnings he might give, all the words he might speak to help him adjust to this new modern era. And in the end, he's just silent. Lestat keeps begging him to stay, saying he has something he wants to say to Lewis. Lewis asks him what it is. Lestat remains silent. And Lewis just kind of nods, holds on to the infant child as he gets up and leaves Lestat to die. On the outside, Lewis might seem very cold and removed from Lestat, but during their conversation, quite a few emotions, imagery, memories sort of arose in his head, and it included this deep and intense sadness that might have even been linked back to his human life when either his father or brother passed. He doesn't allow it to fully surface or to fully flesh out the imagery, so even we as readers aren't 100% sure remember what that moment was, but he like retreats from that grief and like shields himself with all the vampiric detachment he's gained. Even Lestat is going to this place of grief and loss, and then something in his own mind must protect him as well because his eyes get misty and he becomes less coherent. And I wanted to point out this flip between the selfish and the selfless here between Lestat and Louis, because there's something very selfish in Louis's inability to reach out and help Lestat now as he's dying. And it's something that he's doing specifically to protect himself and to maintain his own stoic nature and his own survival. And there's also something very selfless in the way that Lestat is approaching Louis, apologizing for all of his misdeeds, talking about Claudia, talking about their life together, fawning on him and otherwise admiring him for different aspects. And granted, in this there's a kernel of self-motivation because Lestat does want Louis to stay with him. He does recognize a need for him. But there's also something selfless in knowing that you're near the end and wanting to make right or to help alleviate the suffering of those who you leave to linger on. Louis does eventually reveal to Armand that he met up with Lestat, but it's not right away. It's a month or more later. And Armand is deeply upset by this. He asks Louis, but what did you feel? Louis is very confused by this question. He's kind of like thrown by Armand's whole stance. Like, why does Armand care what Louis feels? Why is he so involved? Why is this so unusual from other like long periods the two have gone without speaking to each other? But Armand becomes increasingly distressed, and when he comes to believe that Louis truly felt nothing seeing Lestat and that nothing Lestat said could move him in any way, shape, or form, that's when Armand reveals that he is the one who actually pushed Claudia out into the sun to her death. It's pretty obvious he's trying to get some kind of reaction from Louis, whether it's like anger or for the two of them to like have a fight and like end this resentment and silence between the two of them. I don't know what the goal was in revealing this. I don't even know if it's really true or not. I suppose Louis doesn't know either. He just shrugs it off so nonchalantly. He doesn't even care in investigating this. So we never really get like a good answer. And I don't know that it would matter if we did get an answer or if like this investment that I'm feeling in exactly who killed Claudia matters at all. But I guess Louis is just over entirely because he has no reaction at all to Armand. Not even like those deep internal feelings he had when he was speaking to Lestat. Something in the way his smooth white face reflected it, only for an instant, reminded me of someone else I'd seen defeated in just that way. And it was amazing to me that it took me such a long moment to see Claudia's face in that attitude. Claudia, as she stood by the bed in the room at the Hotel Saint Gabriel, pleading with me to transform Madeline into one of us. That same helpless look, that defeat which seemed to be so heartfelt that everything beyond it was forgotten. And then he, like Claudia, seemed to rally, to pull on some reserve of strength, but he said softly to the air, "I am dying." Page 333, Interview with a Vampire. And here we get Armand coming clean. He admits that he felt Louis would eventually get over Claudia's loss, and that Louis would love him again, and that the two of them would travel the world seeking knowledge and information and mentoring each other in all different kinds of ways. He thought Louis's curiosity would return to him, that it was the one thing within him that would never die. But he is no longer curious. He no longer seeks, and Armand doesn't know what to do with him. And honestly, Louis channels Lestat in this incredibly brutal moment between him and Armand. "I wanted love and goodness in this which is living death," I said. "It was impossible from the beginning, because you cannot have love and goodness when you do what you know to be evil, what you know to be wrong. You can only have the desperate confusion and longing and the chasing of the phantom goodness in all its human form. I knew the real answer to my question before I ever reached Paris. I knew it when I first took a human life to feed my craving. It was my death, and yet I would not accept it, could not accept it, because like all creatures, I don't wish to die. And so I sought other vampires, for God, for the devil, for 100 things under 100 names. And it was all the same. All evil." Page 334, Interview with a Vampire. Once Armand gets this response, he knows there's nothing else to do. Whatever there was or could have been between him and Louis is gone forever. He makes one last attempt. Is there anything else you want of me? Anything else you require? Louis is kind of confused, but he's like, no, bro, I'm fine. I kind of want you to leave so I can stare at this river alone. And Armand walks away from Louis and is never seen again. Louis waits a little while. It takes some time to realize that Armand is gone for good. But when he does, he takes Armand's casket and puts it in the tomb he has for his family. Except eventually Louis becomes uncomfortable with Armand's casket laying there, and he goes to the tomb and rips that casket to tiny little pieces. Louis is back to being slightly emo and at loose ends when he runs into the younger vampire Lestat, and that young vampire begs to be his companion, begs Louis to teach him the ways of the vampire, begs for them to travel the world and be immortal together forever. Louis is not having that. He's been there, done that, does not care to try again, and tells that young vampire if he ever sees him again, he will destroy him. Once that is done, Louis knows that it's all way too much for him. He doesn't want to be around anything familiar or that will remind him of anyone or anything, so he retreats to the woods to be a hermit and to be completely surrounded by all that is unfamiliar. And that, dear reader, is the end to Louis's story. And if you thought that was a lame ending, don't worry, David did too, because he explodes for the first time, loses all sense of professionalism when interviewing anyone. It didn't have to end like that, said the boy, leaning forward. All the things you felt in Paris, the love of Claudia, the feeling, even the feeling for Lestat, it didn't have to end. Not in this despair, because that's what it is, isn't it? Despair. Louis is kind of annoyed by David's outburst, but he sort of shrugs. He's like, yeah, this is inevitable. This is the way things are. Deal with it, human guy. And David pushes, saying that it wouldn't have ended that way for him. Just go on and turn him into a vampire and he will show him all the things that he doesn't get. He's spent too long not being human. Louis doesn't need to be a Debbie Downer all the time. This makes Louis incredibly angry. He's like, you've missed the whole point of this conversation, my guy. And the fact that the only takeaway you have is that you want to be a vampire too, breaks me. And there's only one appropriate response. And that's Louis, grabbing David up and drinking his blood. David scrambles a little bit because he knows the vampire is angry and he doesn't think he's going to be turned. And he's like, am I going to die? Am I going to die? And Louis is like, I don't know. And then he pieces out. Later that afternoon, David awakes. He's woozy. He's got a bite mark up here in his neck he can feel, and he has this tape recorder and he's rewinding it and listening to different portions of the recorder. When he gets to Lestat, off St. Charles Avenue, old house, crumbling, shabby neighborhood, look for rusted railings. David leaves the interview site, presumably going in search of Lestat to get him to turn him into a vampire. And that is the end of Interview with a Vampire. This original story does leave us with some questions, like whether or not David actually finds Lestat, whether or not he actually goes through with searching for him. These are all unanswered, lingering questions that we may or may not get more information for in future vampire installments. I think what ended up sticking with me longest in this story is Claudia and her presence. I'd argue that in a lot of ways the story isn't Louis's but Claudia's, and that makes quite a bit of sense given that Anne Rice wrote this while she was dealing with the grief of the loss of her own child. It also makes sense that Louis would be a character that could never come out of his own grief. But overall, Interview with a Vampire is a beautiful story filled with stylized, poetic writing. Fits right in with Louis's character. As sad and depressed as reading this book makes me, and it does make me quite sad, it's also a beautiful and wonderful story that I would encourage people to read when they feel they're in the space to do. I've had a ton of fun putting these videos together, making this PowerPoint, doing the whole song and dance. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching, and I want to thank you again so much for sticking with me all the way to the end here in part 4, and let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to see more videos in this style, either Lestat the Vampire or some other kind of story in the future. And as always, keep reading. Bye!